Thanks for tuning in. I'm Susan, and I'm going to share with you the secrets to painting furniture so that it looks authentically old and like something you might see in an upscale shop or boutique. My method is the basis for most painted furniture styles. Whether your style is country, French country, English country, shabby chic, cottage, primitive, or rustic, I'm going to help you achieve that look. Painting furniture is not hard. It's something anyone can do, but there are a lot of steps. And before I show you the steps, I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the hardware and take out any drawers. Then we're going to sand the entire piece. Then we're going to wipe it off. Then we're going to prime it. Then we're going to put 2 coats of paint on it. Then we're going to distress it. Then we're going to put an antique glaze. And then finally we're going to put 2 coats of polyurethane on it to seal it. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but the steps go quickly, especially on such a small piece. And it's a great project for busy people because you can do 2 or 3 of the steps in one go and then come back later when you have more time, and you can get it done pretty quickly. It should take about maybe 4 or 5 hours to do the whole thing from start to finish. Let's talk about this piece I've picked. I chose it because I like the shape and it was sturdy. So when you're picking your piece, whether it's a flea market find or yard sale, something you already have, just make sure you like the shape and that it's sturdy. Don't worry about it if it's painted purple and green with polka dots. You can paint over anything as long as you've prepped it correctly. But just make sure you like the shape and that it feels sturdy. Alright, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take off the hardware and pull out the drawers. Now, this is the time when you need to decide whether you're going to keep the hardware that came with the piece or whether you want to use something else. Because you can really change the look of a thing just with the hardware. Look at these pretty glass knobs. This is a great little porcelain knob. Whenever I see a knob that I think is cute, I just buy it if it's on sale. That way I've got them when I want them. But the main thing is to decide right now is, say you wanted to use a pull that uses 2 screws. This would be the time then to fill in this hole with either spackling or wood filler. Then you just let it dry and sand it when you sand down the whole piece. Another thing to remember about hardware is don't lose it. I put mine in a baggie and I try to remember where I leave the baggie. I'll put those in there too. I've got the piece we're working on sitting on top of a coffee table I've already painted, just so you can get sort of an idea of what this table will look like when we're done with it. You probably can't see this, but I have the coffee table protected with some waxed paper. I like to use wax paper rather than newspaper just because things don't stick to it. Alright, let's talk about the sanding. First of all, I want to say I usually wear a mask and do this outside because it's messy. And not only that, if it's an old piece, the varnish and shellac is really something you do not want to breathe. And if it's a painted piece, you can absolutely guarantee that it's lead-based paint. So you really want to do this outside with a mask, with a tarp, and then be careful of what you do with the leftover dust. Now this piece I have today is a new piece, and I'm not so worried about the finish. And I can't talk with a mask on, so I'm just going to go for it. Now, I use 60 grit sandpaper, which is coarse. Now, most people will tell you to use fine or extra fine, but I use the coarse because the whole point of this is to rough up the surface, especially these new pieces that have that slick factory finish. You really want to rough up the surface here and get it so that the paint and the primer will stick. The whole point is not to take the finish off, but again, just to rough it up to make things stick. And you do it in the direction of the grain, and you don't have to use a lot of pressure. And I will say, this part is a little bit scary because there's no coming back after this. Alright, so I'm going to sand the whole thing. You got to be careful when you're painting the drawers because even though it fits nicely now, by the time you put a couple coats of paint and polyurethane and stuff, it is not going to want to close right. So I try not to paint this top ledge, although I end up usually doing it. But you've got to, when you're all done, you got to sand it back down so that the drawer closes smoothly. This little table has a little pull-out, which I can't remove, so I'm just going to have to not paint the sides and just paint back as far as I can get. This little table has a little rattan insert, which is really cute. One reason why I picked it. You can see it's sort of worn over here, and this is not going to take much sanding. But again, I'm going to sand with the grain, and I'm just giving it a little tooth. Alright, once you finish sanding, just take a damp rag and wipe it off. A little tack cloth. Just make sure it's not too wet. But you want to get off all this grit. I use water-based latex primer, mainly because it's less smelly and it's easy soap and water cleanup. There are certain woods, though, that you're going to need to use an oil-based primer. If you're painting pine that has knots in it, you're going to need to use an oil base. Also, if you're going to be painting mahogany, you need to use an oil base. And actually, even with an oil base, mahogany will often leach through and have sort of a pinkish cast if you're painting it light colored. It's not a problem if you're going to paint it dark, but just keep that in mind. All right, I like to use these little short angle brushes. They have little short rubbery handles. They just fit my hand real well, and I don't get cramps. Now I kind of start cutting in like this. And the primer I'm using today is actually tinted, sort of a creamy yellow. It was just left over from another project, so it'll be fine with ours. Alright, so I do use the little foam rollers, though, when I'm rolling. They don't leave brush strokes, and they're just kind of nice and small, and they get into the little nooks and crannies. I just keep my paint in these little plastic cups because it's just easier to deal with small amounts. Now you'll notice that this primer kind of looks chalky and splotchy. That's just the way it looks. So after about an hour, I can come back and put the first coat of paint on. So really, if you started in the morning one day, you took the hardware off and sanded and primed and put the first coat of paint on in the morning, say by lunchtime, you could go back that day and put the second coat on in the afternoon. So you could get a lot of the steps accomplished. The primer's dry and we're ready to put on the first coat of paint. Now I just use regular latex household paint, and I get it either in an eggshell or satin finish. You don't want flat, it's just not durable enough, and you don't want semi-gloss either. We're just gonna, just like when we were priming, we're just gonna cut in with a brush. And you really want thin, even coats rather than big gloppy coats. And you'll definitely have to use 2 coats. I've never gotten away with just 1 coat, and you might sometimes even have to do 3. Now I'm using white paint just right off the shelf. I don't have it tinted to creamy white or anything like that because I'm going to be putting an antique glaze over it, so we'll be changing the color anyhow. But of course you don't have to use white. I'm just using white because that's really kind of the most popular color for painted furniture, and it's just easier to see how I'm going to apply the antique glaze. So I'm just going to hand brush some of these areas that need a lot of paint, and then I'll go back with my roller. Again, I am not painting the sides of this drawer so that it'll continue to slide in and out, and I'm not going to paint the top inside of the drawer. These areas where the ridges are, you kind of have to mush down in there and just get it all covered. And like I say, if you see any drips, wipe them. But if you get a drip and we don't notice it until it's dry, that's okay. We can just sand it away. Nice even coats. Also, you might want to wear clothes that you don't really care about, or like me, you'll end up with an entire wardrobe of painting clothes. I went ahead and put on a second coat and let it dry overnight. And I must say, this piece really has turned out really cute. And a lot of people will stop right here and not do the distressing or the antique glaze. And that's fine. But I think if you did that, I'd go ahead and put a third coat on. I start distressing. I use my 60 grit sandpaper again. But if you're at all intimidated by the sandpaper, go ahead and start with something a little lighter, like maybe a 150 or 200. But like I said, I just use this because it goes quickly. Now, some people use the nails and the hammers and the chains and do all that sort of thing. I don't really do that. Most of my pieces are pretty banged up anyhow. And if you did do that sort of thing, the time to do that would be before you start anything. Another thing to do right now is to go ahead and test your drawer to see if it's going to open and close nicely. Since we're going to be sanding, that'd be the time to go ahead and get it sanded down. But I think we're okay on that. I'm going to go ahead and start. I just go around the edges where things would naturally be distressed. And I'm going to try to get down all the way to the original wood. And that's one reason why I put the antique glaze on later, just because sometimes when you sand it down to that original wood, it looks like new wood. So you need to put the glaze on it so that it does look old. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. Now, one thing you might find, sometimes I spend more time sanding and distressing than anything. And the amount you sand or distress is really up to you. Some people just like a little touch here and there. I like a little more myself. Some people almost take the whole finish off. And that's fine, it's whatever you like. But see, the sanding really kind of starts showing those features. And then the glaze is really going to make it pop too. The corners always get roughed up. The drawers, kind of right around the knobs, might have a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and sand this part off where I got some on accidentally. And also, go around, look for drips. If you've got any drips, sand them off. And like I say, most projects I spend more time sanding than anything. And sometimes I use my electric sander, but most times not, unless it's a big piece. I recently did a kitchen hutch that each step took about an hour and a half. So overall that project took me about 20 hours. I used my sander. All right, now we're going to go down the legs a little bit. Get down by the feet. I always get chewed up down by the feet. And another thing that's important to do is to stand back and look at your piece every couple minutes, just to make sure you're not doing too much, or if you've done enough. Now, I like mine to have a lot of character. I'm probably not going to sand the top part of this desk thing, but I will do the edges in the front. Here's by the knob. Got take my drawer out. Again, just stand back and look and see how you like it. If you sand too much off, you can always go back with paint and cover up what you don't like. But again, I like to go around every edge. It just makes the features of the piece stand out a little bit. Stood back and looked, and I'm pretty satisfied with the level of distressing. You might want a little less or a little bit more. But I think I have decided I want to do something, change these knobs. I like them, but I think I'm going to change the color, and I'll show you how to do that real quickly. We're pretty much through sanding now, but we do need to take a little brush and go up through this rattan part and get all that grit out of there before we go on to the next step. You can see we've generated quite a bit of dust here. You can take a little brush and go all the way around in all the little nooks and crannies to get the dust off. But you should go ahead and just wipe the whole thing down with a damp rag just to get all that grit off. Well, I actually ended up using my vacuum attachment to go ahead and vacuum out this rattan top because there was pretty much grit down, and it is important to get that all off before you start the glazing. Now, I am going to show you how to make glaze, but first I want to go ahead and do something with these knobs. I was going to use some silver rub I have, but actually it turns out I just have gold. So I'm just going to use some craft paint instead. I'm just going to use my finger. I know I probably should wear gloves, but I'm not a glove person, so I'm just going to spread it on with my finger. Get all the way around the bottom. I might take some of it off with a paper towel. Just wanted them to be a little bit lighter than they were. They're a little bit dark in contrast with the white piece. And those will dry in just a few minutes. I'm going to set them over here on my work table and do this last little one. You know, when my son was little, he used to watch me paint furniture. And when I got to the part where I'd sand and distress it, he always would say, "But why are you ruining it?" And I would tell him, that's just the way I like it. I like it to look old. And actually, that is one thing. Most of the pieces I paint were pretty much headed to the dump anyhow. This one has a big gash in it, which is why I'm sure somebody gave it to me. Alright, that's about it. Those will dry in just a few minutes. I'll put that away. And then we're going to talk about glaze. Now, you can buy pre-made antique glaze, but I'm going to show you how to make your own. People get intimidated when they hear the word glaze, but it's really very simple. All glaze is untinted paint. And what we're going to do is mix a small amount of color with the glazing medium to make our antiquing glaze. I usually use 1 part color to 3 parts glaze. And the glaze comes in a small bottle like this from the craft store, or you can buy it at the home improvement store by the quart or the gallon. This is just a sort of brownish gray craft paint from the craft store. I'm going to shake it up a little bit. And I use a glass bowl just so I can see if I've got it mixed up pretty well. I don't measure this, I just sort of eyeball it. And I use a ratty old brush so I can really get down into the nooks and crannies. You really don't need much, especially for a piece this small. And the glaze does not change the color of the paint, but it changes the translucency. So you might like yours a little darker or a little lighter. I'm going to put a little more in. And the other thing is once you put it on, if you think it's too dark or too light, you can wipe it off with a wet paper towel if you do it right away. Okay. Now, when you put the antiquing glaze on, the easy part is kind of the nooks and crannies. I'm going to show you. You really just sort of brush it on, get it way down in there, and then you're going to wipe most of it off. The hard part is actually these big planes, and I'm going to show you how to do that, because you kind of have to fool with that a little bit more so it doesn't look so fake. All right, now it's a wet paper towel. I'm going to take a dry one, and I'm just going to wipe off most of it. See, it's kind of getting stuck down the cracks. You don't want to leave too much in there because it does look kind of fakey. But you can see it's changed the color a little bit. This is a little bit light, although I think I kind of like it that way. I want to go ahead and do this part up here because I got a little bit up on that ledge. And then I'm going to show you that big broad area. You kind of have to keep a wet edge with the glaze. In other words, don't let it dry without wiping it off. Okay, this big area. Now this isn't really a huge area, but say you are doing the top of a coffee table. It gets a little fakey looking unless you can kind of wipe it off in a way that doesn't look like brush marks or paper towel marks. But go ahead and cover the whole thing. You know, make sure you push it down into little holes or nooks. Okay. Now I'm going to take my dry towel and just start lightly wiping it off. You might need several of these. I'm just sort of smudging it in, trying to make it look so it doesn't have obvious brush marks. And you might want to pat it, just kind of find your own little way of evening things out. Got some up in the top I need to get. And like I said, you know, a piece like this isn't that huge, but when you've got a 6-foot coffee table, it does get a little tricky. All right, I'm going to continue glazing the legs, and I'm going to do the top, the rattan top last, because actually I've only done that once before, and that might be a little tricky. I've glazed the whole piece except for the top, this rattan, and I wanted to show you this in case we run into problems. Just liberally mushing it in with my little ratty brush. I may need to mix a little bit more glaze. Okay, I'm trying to get it really jammed in there. I think I'm going to go ahead and start wiping just in case I got a problem. It's kind of hard to get down into those little holes. And I'm not sure if I told you, but this little piece has a glass insert that goes right here. So that's going to be really cute. You can put things under the glass. I'm going to try different things. I've got some old lace hankies I am going to have to daub into here, into the holes. But generally it's looking pretty good. But I might even have to go back with a Q-tip or something like that. You're not going to run into this problem though unless you have something with a rattan top. So we're getting close to finishing our piece. After I finish glazing this top, it needs to dry for a good bit. If you can let it dry overnight, that's the best. But it's possible to do it, like glaze it in the morning and then put the first coat of polyurethane on later that day. You'll know if you haven't waited long enough if your polyurethane brush has glaze on it. Alright, I'm going to have to mix some more. I'm going to do that. And then we'll come back and finish our piece. the glaze is dried and we're getting ready to do our last couple of steps, which is to seal our piece with 2 coats of polyurethane. That means a couple of things. It means this is your last opportunity to go around and make sure you've made every change you want to your piece, because once we've sealed it, you can't paint over it again unless you prime it. And that's actually one thing I really like about polyurethane. You can paint over it. I also like the fact that it's water-based and easy to use, easy cleanup. It allows you to be able to clean the piece with a damp paper towel. Now, some people do prefer to finish their piece with paste wax. They even make tinted paste wax, but there's a couple of drawbacks. The tinted wax is actually very hard to find and it's expensive. It's a lot of work. You'll definitely get a workout. But the main reason I don't like it is because once you've used it, since it's a petroleum-based product, you can never paint over your piece again unless you strip it. And to me, that is just too restricting. It does have a beautiful, mellow finish, though. But our polyurethane does, too. I use a matte finish. And you always want to make sure you stir your polyurethane. Never shake it. It bruises it. Just kidding. And I'm just using a brush today because this is such a small little piece. And the brushes get right into those little crevices. Now we're going to put 2 coats on for a couple reasons. It just gives it a little extra protection. But also, I almost always end up missing a spot because it's hard to see where you've been. So I figure if I do 2 coats, I'll have gotten everything. It'll feel dry to the touch, really, almost probably in 30 minutes. But if you go to set a lamp and put magazines on it, they're going to stick. So if you can bring it into the house, especially if you've been painting in the garage or someplace that's not a climate-controlled location, let it cure for, 2 or 3 days before you start setting things on top of it. The longer you wait, the better. I just finished painting the 2nd coat of polyurethane on my piece. I waited about an hour in between coats. And I did go ahead and put some on these knobs since we just used craft paint to color those. Now really the only thing I have left to do is let it dry for a good 2 or 3 days and get cured so I can put the glass piece in. Now that we've finished painting the piece, I wanted to show you some options of what you could put under the glass to make your table personal and special to you. As you can see here, I've got some old family photographs, little black and whites, just sort of randomly placed under the glass. It looks very sweet. Here I've placed an old lace wedding hanky that was my mother's and some little doilies that my grandmother had made. It's a great way to preserve and display old vintage linens. Here's a nice vintage luncheon napkin, and you could even use some dried fern fronds or pressed flowers. Just use your imagination. I'm sure you can come up with something great. The best thing about being done with your project is you have all the leftover supplies to start on a new one. All you have to do is go out and find it, and to me that's the most fun part. Thanks again for choosing Decorating Magic. Happy hunting!